It began with a voice that clawed through the static of a 911 dispatcher's headset. Panicked, shaky, on the edge of breaking. "My wife, she's not breathing. Please, you have to send someone. She fell down the stairs." The caller identified himself as Mark Reynolds, a husband from the quiet suburbs of Pleasanton. His words tumbled out frantic and uneven, before the line went eerily still. For dispatchers, the silence was chilling. They tried to call back. No answer. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights cut across the pristine Reynolds home, a two-story house framed with trimmed hedges and a freshly painted porch. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering. Nothing ever happened on this street. Nothing but barbecues, car washes, and the sound of children playing. But tonight, the stillness was broken. Paramedics rushed inside to find Lisa Reynolds, 34 years old, lying motionless at the bottom of the staircase. Her body was crumpled unnaturally, one arm bent awkwardly beneath her. A glass of red wine sat untouched on the counter nearby. Mark, 38, was on his knees, his voice hoarse from screaming. He rocked back and forth, clutching his head, insisting over and over, "She fell! She just fell!" The EMTs moved quickly, checking for vital signs. But even as they worked, something felt off. Lisa's injuries didn't look like the result of a stumble. There were deep bruises around her neck, finger-shaped. Her head trauma was inconsistent with a single fall. One paramedic would later describe it as watching a man audition for sorrow. Neighbors gathered outside, murmuring. Some prayed under their breath. Others speculated. The Reynolds had always seemed like the perfect couple, but now under the blinding wash of police lights, that illusion was cracking. What looked like a tragic accident might be something far darker. And investigators were about to discover that behind the Reynolds' manicured lawn and picture-perfect smiles lay secrets that would shake the community to its core.
On the surface, Mark and Lisa Reynolds seemed like the American dream personified. Their story was one neighbors retold at dinner tables, an example of love, stability, and success. Mark Reynolds was born in 1968 to a working-class family in Sacramento. His father was a mechanic, his mother a secretary. By most accounts, he was an ambitious child, always eager to prove himself. Teachers remembered him as charming, sometimes too charming. He was the kind of boy who could talk his way out of trouble, who could charm a grade higher than he'd earned. In college, he studied finance, quickly developing a reputation for confidence that bordered on arrogance. He wore expensive suits to presentations and bragged about the big future he was destined for. Friends from those days would later remark that Mark always wanted to be the man in control. Lisa, on the other hand, was his opposite in many ways. Born in 1972, she grew up in a small, close-knit town in Oregon. Her parents were teachers, and she inherited their love for education. After earning her degree, she became a school teacher herself, pouring her energy into her students. They adored her patience, her kindness, and her ability to make even the most nervous child feel safe. Where Mark was ambitious and outwardly confident, Lisa was warm, empathetic, and grounded. When they met at a charity fundraiser in San Francisco, sparks flew. He was the charming financial advisor, smooth-talking and quick with compliments. She was the gentle teacher who blushed at his attention. Within 2 years, they were married. Their life together looked enviable. They bought a comfortable 2-story home in Pleasanton, hosted barbecues in the summer, and sent out Christmas cards with professional family photos. Mark's career flourished, at least on the outside, while Lisa's classroom became a second home for dozens of children who adored her. To friends and neighbors, they were the golden couple. Mark was always smiling, holding Lisa's hand in public, pulling out her chair at dinner parties. He brought her flowers to work, posting photos on social media with captions like, "Lucky to have her by my side." One neighbor later said, If you asked me then, I'd have told you they were perfect, the kind of couple you'd want your kids to grow up and emulate. But behind the glossy photos and social media posts, Lisa's world was very different. She confided in her closest friends that Mark's charm had another side. At home, he could be short-tempered, controlling about money, and dismissive of her opinions. He wanted things done his way, always his way. At first, Lisa brushed it off, telling herself it was stress from his job. But over time, she grew uneasy. There were small moments her friends would remember vividly. The way Mark's jaw tightened when Lisa spoke too long at a dinner party. The sharp tone he used with her in private, quickly replaced by a smile when others entered the room. Lisa's journals, later recovered by police, revealed even more. She wrote about feeling trapped, about how Mark's love felt conditional, like she had to earn it by meeting his expectations. One chilling entry read, "Sometimes I don't recognize him. It's like he wears a mask in front of everyone else, and only I see what's behind it." Still, Lisa stayed. She loved her students, loved her home, and wanted to believe the man she married was still inside the one she lived with. But the cracks in the marriage were widening, and soon those cracks would split open.
For years, the Reynolds marriage looked flawless from the outside. But behind closed doors, Lisa was living in a very different reality. Her friends noticed the changes first. Lisa, who used to be light-hearted and quick to laugh, had grown quieter. At lunch dates, she often checked her phone nervously, making sure she didn't miss a call from Mark. If she stayed out too long, she'd make excuses, claiming she needed to get back before he got worried. One friend remembered, it wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Her voice got smaller, like she didn't want to admit she was afraid of him. Mark's need for control seeped into every part of their marriage. He scrutinized household spending, demanded explanations for small purchases, and frequently accused Lisa of being too naive with money. If she disagreed, he would explode into anger, then quickly apologize with flowers or gifts, insisting he just wanted the best for them. But beneath the apologies, Lisa began to see a pattern. Control, explosion, apology, repeat. The financial strain only made it worse. Though Mark bragged to friends about his thriving career, the truth was much darker. Behind the polished office facade, he was drowning in gambling debts. Poker nights stretched into weekends at casinos where he chased losses he couldn't afford. Investigators later uncovered that Mark had siphoned money from clients. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. His once respected reputation in finance was on the verge of collapse, and Lisa had begun to notice. At school, she confided in a colleague that she wasn't sure who Mark really was anymore. She admitted she sometimes thought about leaving, but worried about what he might do if she tried. "He doesn't like losing," she whispered, "and I think that includes me." The tension escalated in subtle but telling ways. Lisa's friends noticed bruises she brushed off as clumsiness. A cousin remembered Lisa showing up at a family gathering with sunglasses on indoors, joking about a migraine, but looking shaken. Police records later revealed that Lisa once visited the local station to inquire about filing a protective order. She never followed through. Officers described her as nervous, reluctant, and visibly torn. She said she wasn't sure yet if she wanted to take action. Tragically, her hesitation may have cost her life. As Mark's financial troubles deepened, his mask began to slip more often. Lisa described nights of shouting, slammed doors, and icy silence. And when she once hinted at leaving, Mark's reaction chilled her. "If you walk out that door, you'll regret it."
It was a cold November night in Pleasanton, the kind of night when the streets fall silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Inside the Reynolds house, though, that silence was broken. Neighbors later reported hearing muffled shouting around 9:30 p.m. It wasn't unusual to hear couples argue, but something about this sounded different, tense, sharp, and desperate. One neighbor told police she thought about knocking on the door but convinced herself it wasn't her business. "They always looked so happy," she said.
By midnight, the quiet had returned, but behind the closed doors of the Reynolds home, tragedy, or so it seemed, had struck. At 12:47 a.m., Mark Reynolds dialed 911. His voice, frantic and broken, rang through the dispatcher's headset. "My wife, she's not breathing. Please hurry. She fell down the stairs." Moments later, the line went dead. Paramedics arrived minutes later, their boots echoing against the polished hardwood as they rushed inside. Lisa's body was found at the base of the staircase. She was dressed in her nightclothes, her hair tangled, her face pale and lifeless. Her arms were bent awkwardly, her legs twisted beneath her. Mark knelt beside her, clutching his head in his hands. He sobbed loudly, rocking back and forth, insisting, "It was an accident. She just fell. She was drinking, she slipped." But even as they worked, EMTs exchanged uneasy glances. Lisa's injuries didn't match his story. They were deep, dark bruises around her neck, shaped like fingerprints. Her head wound seemed inconsistent with a fall down 12 stairs. And the positioning of her body looked unnatural, as though she had been placed there rather than fallen. Detectives soon arrived to secure the scene. They noted details that didn't add up. A wine glass on the counter, perfectly upright, filled but untouched. Lisa's shoes neatly placed beside the staircase, as though carefully arranged. The absence of spilled wine, overturned objects, or signs of chaos that a sudden fall might cause. And then there was Mark. His grief was loud, dramatic, almost theatrical. One detective would later say, "It felt like I was watching a bad actor." He wanted us to believe his pain, but something about it seemed rehearsed. He claimed Lisa had been drinking earlier in the evening, that she lost her footing and tumbled down the stairs. But paramedics noticed the faint smell of bleach in the air, unusual for a midnight accident scene. When officers gently asked Mark to recount the night's events, his story wavered. First he said they had been watching television, then he said Lisa had gone upstairs to get something and slipped. Details shifted each time he repeated them. Outside, neighbors stood huddled in the glow of police lights, whispering in disbelief. They had always envied the Reynolds marriage. Now they watched Mark being escorted to a patrol car for questioning, his sobs echoing across the quiet street. What happened inside that house was no ordinary accident, and soon investigators would begin pulling at threads that would unravel the entire facade of Mark Reynolds' life.
From the very first walkthrough, detectives knew something was off. They had seen dozens of staircase accidents over the years. This one didn't fit. The first red flag came from the coroner's preliminary assessment. Lisa's injuries weren't consistent with tumbling down the stairs. She had distinct bruises on her forearms, the kind you see when someone raises their arms to defend themselves. Around her neck, faint marks formed the outline of fingers. And though Mark swore she had been drinking wine before her fall, toxicology later revealed her system was completely clean. The accident was looking less and less accidental. Detectives examined the Reynolds home in painstaking detail. The wine glass on the counter was upright, filled to the halfway mark, yet there were no fingerprints on it, no smudges, no lipstick stain. Forensics later confirmed that Lisa's prints weren't even on the glass. Someone had staged it, carefully. Lisa's shoes were another oddity. They weren't scattered as though kicked off before bed. Instead, they were neatly aligned at the foot of the stairs, almost as if someone wanted it to look tidy, presentable, deliberate. And then came the faint but undeniable smell of bleach in the air. Detectives swabbed the staircase banister and floorboards. Forensic analysis later revealed faint traces of blood that had been hastily cleaned. The Reynolds home wasn't a crime scene of chaos. It was a crime scene of choreography. Mark, under the microscope. As investigators began piecing things together, their attention turned squarely to Mark. At first, he played the role of the devastated husband. In interviews, he wept, insisting over and over, "She slipped. I loved her. I would never hurt her." But detectives noticed how quickly his emotions could turn on and off. One moment he was sobbing uncontrollably, the next he was calmly answering logistical questions about funeral arrangements. When pressed about Lisa's injuries, he became defensive. "She bruised easily," he insisted. "She must have grabbed the railing when she fell." But detectives weren't buying it. As they dug deeper into Mark's life, his carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Bank records revealed gambling debts that stretched into the tens of thousands, credit cards maxed out, mortgage payments behind schedule. But perhaps most chilling of all, Mark had taken out multiple life insurance policies on Lisa totaling nearly $750,000. Each one had been updated within the past year. To detectives, the motive was becoming clear. Mark was drowning financially, desperate for a way out, and Lisa, tragically, had become his solution. The next blow to Mark's image came from his phone records. Detectives noticed dozens of late-night calls and text messages exchanged with a coworker named Emily. The texts started out flirtatious, but in the weeks leading up to Lisa's death, they became more serious, even sinister. Messages spoke of starting fresh, building a new life together, and soon it will just be us. Emily was brought in for questioning. Tearfully, she admitted the affair but insisted she had no knowledge of what Mark was planning. She described him as charming, persuasive, and at times obsessive. One text exchange sealed the picture for investigators. "Mark, I can't keep living like this. Everything will be better soon. Just wait." Emily, "What do you mean?" Mark, "Trust me. A new life is coming." Even with motive and opportunity, detectives still needed hard evidence. They found it on a grainy gas station surveillance tape. Just an hour before Lisa's death, Mark was seen entering a convenience store. He walked directly to the cleaning aisle and purchased bleach, gloves, and heavy-duty trash bags. The timestamp was damning. Why would a husband on a quiet night at home suddenly need industrial cleaning supplies just before his wife supposedly fell down the stairs? Detectives now had motive, money and affair, opportunity, he was home alone with Lisa, and evidence of premeditation. The cleaning supplies, the staged scene. It was enough to arrest Mark Reynolds for the murder of his wife. The mask slips. When officers placed him in cuffs, neighbors stood stunned in their driveways. This was the man who smiled at block parties, who flipped burgers at barbecues, who kissed his wife's cheek in front of everyone. One neighbor whispered, "If he could do that, anyone could." Mark's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The perfect husband, the charming neighbor, the successful professional, now accused of killing the woman everyone thought he adored. But the courtroom would reveal even more. Because as devastating as the investigation was, the trial was where Mark's mask would be ripped off completely, exposing the monster behind the smile.
The trial of Mark Reynolds opened to a packed courtroom. Reporters filled every bench, sketch artists sharpened pencils, and locals stood in line outside hoping for a seat. Everyone wanted to see the man who once played the role of perfect husband, now standing accused of cold-blooded murder. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Prosecutors framed the case as a clear-cut story of greed and betrayal. The defense insisted it was a tragic accident, nothing more. The question was simple. Would the jury believe Mark's performance of grief or the mountain of evidence pointing to premeditation? The prosecution went first. In calm, deliberate tones, the lead prosecutor told the jury, Mark Reynolds was a man drowning in debt, desperate to escape his problems. He saw his wife not as a partner, but as a payday. And when he decided his only way out was through her death, he staged a scene to cover his tracks. They laid out the evidence. the life insurance policies, the affair, the defensive wounds, and the bleach and trash bag shopping trip. Piece by piece, they built the picture of a man who had carefully planned the unthinkable. The defense countered with a very different story. Their attorney described Lisa's death as a household tragedy, insisting Mark's grief was genuine. They told the jury that the prosecution's case was built on assumptions and coincidences, not hard fact. They painted Mark as a loving husband, devastated by loss, unfairly demonized by police who wanted a villain. The stage was set. The first emotional blow came from Lisa's friends. One by one, they testified about the private Lisa they knew, the one who confided her fears about Mark. Her best friend, voice trembling, recalled their final conversation. She told me she was scared of him. She said, "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll tell them to look at Mark." Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Jurors scribbled notes. Mark's face flushed as he shook his head, whispering to his attorney. Another colleague from the school described Lisa's growing anxiety. She would check her phone constantly during lunch, always worried about missing his call. It was like she wasn't free anymore. Each testimony chipped away at Mark's facade. Then came the medical examiner, who presented the most damning physical evidence. With clinical precision, he described the injuries. Bruises around Lisa's neck, consistent with strangulation, not a fall. Defensive wounds on her forearms, proving she fought back. Head trauma inconsistent with tumbling downstairs. This was not an accident, he told the jury. Lisa Reynolds was the victim of a homicide. The defense tried to push back, suggesting the bruises could have come from previous falls or even CPR attempts. But the examiner didn't waver. "These marks," he said firmly, pointing to photographs of Lisa's neck, "were made by human hands." The prosecution then introduced Mark's phone records. Jurors saw late-night text exchanges with his coworker Emily, messages about a new life, about leaving everything behind. Emily herself took the stand. Nervous and tearful, she admitted the affair but insisted she had no knowledge of Mark's plans. "She told me he wasn't happy in his marriage, but I never thought he would do something like this." The defense painted her as a distraction, arguing that infidelity didn't equal murder. But the implication was clear. Mark wasn't a grieving husband. He was a man preparing to replace his wife. Perhaps the most crushing piece of evidence came in the form of grainy surveillance footage. Jurors watched as Mark walked into a gas station convenience store just an hour before Lisa's death. They saw him select bleach, gloves, and trash bags, pay in cash, and leave. The courtroom was silent as the video played. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "Does this look like a man preparing for a quiet night at home, or does this look like a man preparing to clean up a crime?" Against his attorney's advice, Mark chose to testify. It was his chance to convince the jury he was innocent. Dressed in a dark suit, he spoke softly, his voice heavy with sorrow. He described the night as an ordinary evening that turned into tragedy. He said, "She slipped. I loved her. I would never hurt her." Tears streamed down his face as he recounted dialing 911. But under cross-examination, his story began to unravel. He contradicted himself about what they were doing before Lisa's fall. He became defensive when asked about the life insurance policies. And when pressed about the bleach purchase, his explanation, "household chores," rang hollow. One juror later admitted, "It felt like he was trying too hard to sell us a story." The trial stretched for weeks. Each day brought new testimony, new evidence, and new emotional breakdowns from Lisa's family seated in the gallery. Reporters described the atmosphere as electric, with spectators holding their breath during key moments. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Headlines read, "Perfect husband" or "Calculated killer." Neighbors gave interviews, some in disbelief, others admitting they had always sensed something strange about Mark's perfect image. The community was divided, but inside the courtroom, the evidence was stacking up. When closing arguments arrived, the prosecution spoke with measured certainty. Lisa Reynolds didn't fall. She was pushed, strangled, and staged. Mark Reynolds wanted her gone. For money, for freedom, for another woman. Do not let him hide behind his mask any longer. The defense made one final plea for doubt, urging jurors to consider the possibility of accident. They said, "Don't destroy a man's life based on speculation. Sometimes tragedy needs no villain." But the jury had seen enough. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and long days in court, the fate of Mark Reynolds rested in the hands of 12 jurors. The deliberations began on a Thursday morning. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, speculating on how long it would take. Some thought it might drag on for days, given the complexity of the evidence. Others whispered that the case was so strong, it could be over in hours. Inside the jury room, the discussions were intense, but surprisingly swift. The gas station footage, the life insurance policies, the medical examiner's testimony, it all painted a picture too clear to ignore. As one juror later put it, "We didn't have to connect dots. The dots were already connected." Less than 2 days later, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The atmosphere was electric. Lisa's family sat holding hands, bracing for the moment. Mark sat at the defense table, shoulders stiff, his once confident smile long gone. The clerk stood and read the verdict aloud. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Reynolds, guilty." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Lisa's mother wept openly, clutching a framed photo of her daughter. Friends embraced, whispering prayers of relief. Mark showed little reaction. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, eyes blank. For the first time, the mask seemed gone, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who thought he could outsmart everyone and failed. At sentencing, the judge spoke firmly. "Mr. Reynolds, your actions were deliberate, selfish, and devastating. You robbed a young woman of her life, her family of her daughter, her students of her teacher. For this crime, you will spend the rest of your life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel came down. The case was closed. But outside the courtroom, the shockwaves were only just beginning. The guilty verdict brought closure in the legal sense, but for Lisa's family and community, the pain was only beginning. Lisa's mother sobbed as she left the courtroom, clutching her daughter's photo. "We got justice," she told reporters through tears, "but nothing will bring Lisa back. Nothing." Her father stood beside her, silent, his face pale with grief. Friends surrounded them, but their presence could do little to fill the void left by Lisa's absence. At the elementary school where Lisa had taught, the hallways felt emptier. Her students, too young to fully understand, asked their parents why Mrs. Reynolds wasn't coming back. Teachers did their best to explain, but the loss lingered like a shadow over the classrooms. In her honor, the school planted a memorial garden. Children placed hand-painted stones with her name written in bright colors. A plaque was mounted that read, "In loving memory of Mrs. Reynolds, forever in our hearts." One parent described the dedication ceremony. "There wasn't a dry eye. She touched so many lives. It's hard to believe one person could mean that much to so many. And now she's gone."
When the gavel came down and Mark Reynolds was sentenced to life without parole, the man who once walked with confidence into boardrooms and barbecues was reduced to a number. Inmate number 76429. Gone were the tailored suits, the polished shoes, the bright smile that charmed clients and neighbors. Inside San Quentin, Mark was just another prisoner. Gray uniform, steel cot, and a routine dictated by guards, not by his own will. Prison staff later described Mark as quiet, withdrawn, and often avoiding interaction with other inmates. In the yard, he kept to himself. He wasn't part of any gang or group. He ate alone.
Some inmates mocked him when his case aired on television. Others avoided him altogether, labeling him a domestic offender, the lowest rung in prison hierarchy. For a man who once craved admiration and control, prison life was the ultimate humiliation. True to form, Mark tried to claw back some sense of control. He filed multiple appeals, each one claiming trial errors or misinterpretations of evidence. But appellate judges reviewed the overwhelming case against him and swiftly denied them all. Each rejection chipped away at the illusion he had built for himself, that he could outthink the system, that he could charm his way out of anything.
Mark Reynolds' story ended in a cold prison cell, but Lisa's story did not end at the bottom of that staircase. Her family refused to let her memory be defined by the man who took her life. In the years following her death, they created the Lisa Reynolds Foundation, dedicated to raising awareness about domestic abuse, coercive control, and the warning signs so many people overlook. They spoke at schools, churches, and community centers, sharing Lisa's story in the hope that others might find the courage to leave before it's too late. The case of Mark and Lisa Reynolds became more than just another headline. It became a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about appearances, trust, and the darkness that can hide in plain sight. It taught neighbors and families to look beyond the smiles and flowers, to pay attention to the quiet signals of fear and isolation. It reminded communities that silence can be deadly, and that victims often feel trapped not because they are weak, but because they are controlled.
If stories like this move you, and you want more real-life cases that reveal the truth behind the headlines, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss the next powerful story we bring to life.